Do you ever feel confused about climate change? Yep, we are probably all familiar with the media warnings of impending climate change, but if you had to explain this to your child, could you? I couldn't have. Not until I met Dr. Frank Mitloehner, the greenhouse guru. I met him at a conference this year where he was a speaker, and I admittedly had a very loose knowledge of what was driving climate change. Most of what I knew, I'd absorbed from the nightly news and social media. So Dr. Mitloehner's talk really opened my eyes to the breadth and depth of this issue. I learned a lot from him, and I thought he would be a perfect guest to bring on the show to share his expertise with you. My hope is that you'll get a better understanding of climate change, so not only you can practice earth-sensitive behaviors, but you can also help your children understand and practice them too. So let's dig in. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Now, before we get started, I wanted to remind you that I'll be taking some time off from the podcast this summer. No worries. This just means that I've picked some of my absolute favorite episodes over the past few years, and I'm going to reshare them with you this summer. So the schedule will be the same. Every 2 weeks, you can expect to see a new episode pop up, but the new episode will be a reshare of an old podcast episode. I will be back in the fall with a lineup of new guests and topics, so I can't wait to get back into it then. You might be wondering, what will I be doing this summer? I am working on a brand new website, and you'll be able to find it over at thenourishedchild.com. This site is a little bit different from jillcastle.com. This site will be dedicated to educating parents and kids about nutrition and feeding through online programs, classes, workshops, and guidebooks. Not only will I be building out the site, I'll be launching it and adding some new topics and resources there as well. I'll be sure to let you know when it goes live. Now, to introduce you to my guest, Dr. Frank Mitloehner is a professor and air quality specialist in cooperative extension in the Department of Animal Science at the University of California, Davis. As such, he works with students at the undergraduate and graduate levels, scientists, farmers, and ranchers, as well as with the public at large, both domestically and abroad. He's passionate about understanding and mitigating air emissions from livestock operations, and he studies the implications of these emissions for the health and safety of farm workers and neighboring communities. He's served as chairman of a global United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization partnership project to benchmark the environmental footprint of livestock production. He was a work group member on the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology under President Barack Obama and a member of the National Academies of Science Institute of Medicine Committee on a framework for assessing the health, environmental, and social effects of the food system. Dr. Mitloehner received a Master's of Science degree in Animal Science and Agricultural Engineering from the University of Leipzig, Germany, and a doctoral degree in Animal Science from Texas Tech University. So, without further ado, here's Dr. Mitloehner. Hello, Dr. Mitloehner, and welcome to The Nourished Child.
Hello to you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. I'm glad to actually have a conversation with you again. We did meet at a conference in Budapest, and I have to admit, I was highly educated from your presentation on climate change and greenhouse gases. So I'm super excited to share that with my audience because I think it's an area of confusion for a lot of people. So let's start with just a really basic question, which is, what is climate change?
Yeah, so our world's atmosphere is very complex. It's very complex. There are certain gases that are referred to as greenhouse gases, and these gases are in our atmosphere. And they're actually very important to us because on any normal day, we have solar radiation coming into our atmosphere, and they hit the Earth's surface, and normally the solar radiation were reflected back into space. Without greenhouse gases, that is exactly what would happen. Solar radiation would come in, be reflected off on the surface of Earth, and go back into space. And if that were to happen, life on Earth would be way too cold for us to live here. Because of greenhouse gases, some of that solar radiation is retained back in our atmosphere because these gas molecules actually retain the heat from the sun. So these are gases such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and others that function in a way where they absorb the solar radiation of the sunlight. And that's really important. So why are we talking about climate change? We're talking about climate change because while the Earth was relatively stable climate-wise for a long time, it's now warming. And that trend has really started about 70 years ago or so. And it's worrisome because different ecosystems respond very sensitive to a changing climate, and agriculture responds to it. And the discussion now is, what causes climate change? Is it human activity that does it or that contributes to it? And that's really what it's all about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So from a scientific standpoint, you mentioned that different environments respond differently to the warming of our planet. Can you give us, some examples from a scientific standpoint that sort of proves that the world is actually warming up, that we're experiencing climate change?
Yeah, so we are in a situation where we have monitoring devices such as satellites that have certain sensors on board. And these satellites can actually monitor, let's say, different gases in the atmosphere in all parts of the world. And they show us that there are accumulations of, let's say, methane gas or CO2 gas or others in certain regions of the world. For example, in areas of Russia, Siberia, that was previously rock hard and frozen, we now see that the ground is warming, thawing, and while that's happening, large amounts of methane come out of the ground and into the atmosphere. That is part of a changing climate. We see a changing climate occurring at the poles. The North Pole in particular shows a drastic change in the amount of ice cap that we have. And it's a concern because there's so much ice melting that it actually leads to a swelling of our oceans. And so we see in various parts of the world gases emanating from various sources. And in those same places, we see ecosystems responding. Again, quite troublesome in many ways.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned greenhouse gases and you said CO2, methane. I think you mentioned another one. Can you just walk us? Yeah, nitrous oxide. Can you walk us through what each of those sort of, how each of those impact climate change individually, where the gases are coming from?
Yes, and this gets a little bit complicated, but it's very important, okay? It's very important. So I will limit my comments to 3 of these greenhouse gases. There's carbon dioxide, then there's methane, and nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide is what you and I are exhaling right now, but it's really a gas that is mainly associated with the burning of fossil fuel, burning of oil, coal, gas. And let's stay with CO2 for a little while, okay? So oil, coal, gas, what is that really? What is fossil fuel? Where does it come from? We know it was stored in the earth, in the ground, but what was it originally? Well, fossil fuels are nothing other than plant and animal material that died, that fossilized and accumulated in the ground hundreds of millions of years ago. And the energy that's contained in that oil, coal, and gas is nothing other than solar radiation from hundreds of millions of years ago that amassed in that biomass during photosynthesis back then. Then it accumulated in the ground, and over the last 70 or so years, we have extracted about half of the fossil fuels in the Earth's crust. And what did we do with that fossil fuel? We burned it. So by and large, that oil, coal, and gas is nothing other than carbon. And what we do with it is when we burn it, we release it into the atmosphere.
So Dr. Mitloehner, we're talking about, coal mining and oil drilling. Is that what you're talking about when you say fossil fuel?
Yeah, this is the extraction that you were referring to, the drilling and the mining, just the extraction. But what do we do with that fossil fuel then, with the coal and with the oil and with gas?
Mm-hmm.
We produce power in the case of coal and gas, right? We are burning it and making power from it. That's what runs our systems. And the oil is largely converted into gasoline, and we burn that as well in our vehicles. So transportation, power production and use, certain industries like the steel industry and so on are very energy hungry, and they all burn fossil fuels. And when they do burn fossil fuels, then the resulting carbon is accumulating in the atmosphere. Okay, so that's CO2, and that by far is the number one most important greenhouse gas by mass. There's nothing else, no other greenhouse gas more important with respect of total amounts than CO2.
And in terms of climate change.
And in terms of climate change as well. Now, CO2 is not as potent on a per molecule basis as methane or nitrous oxide, but there is so much of it that it just is the most important greenhouse gas of all.
So for parents that are listening, and you talk about burning fossil fuel, I just want to break this down for them in terms of, being able to imagine where they might be participating in climate change. So it's driving their cars, taking a flight across America, hopping on a train every day to go to work. Like that's what we're talking about, right? When we talking about CO2 and the atmosphere.
Yeah, the main culprits are really 30 or so companies, okay, like Exxon and Shell and Texaco and so on. Those big fossil fuel companies, they are the main emitter of CO2 emissions. Then there are coal-fired power plants. They are emitting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. The use of fossil fuel emits a total of 80% of all greenhouse gases. So these are three sectors. It's transportation, it's power production and use, and it's industries such as the cement industry and the steel industry. These three sectors, again, transportation, power production and use, and the industry doing cement, producing cement, steel, and so on, these three combined produce 80% of all greenhouse gases in the United States and the majority of greenhouse gases worldwide. Now, in contrast to that, agriculture, so all the plants and animals that we produce in order to have food, agriculture overall emits 10% of our greenhouse gases. What's interesting to note, though, is that agriculture, in contrast to fossil fuel-related sources, does not just emit greenhouse gases, but it's also a sink for greenhouse gases because soils and plants take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So this is a component and a very important nuance that's oftentimes left out of the discussion when it comes to the effects of our food on climate. Because our food system is not just a source, but also an important sink of greenhouse gases.
So sink, let's define that word a little bit, because I understand what you're saying in terms of it being a sink, but a parent listening might not understand what you mean by that.
Absolutely. So let me first talk about what a source is. So let's imagine we were to go barbecue, okay? And you buy a bag of coal and we burn that bag of coal. Mm-hmm. What becomes of that coal? Well, we'll have a little bit of ash left over by the end of burning of that coal. And of course, we have heat and we have carbon going into the atmosphere. Pretty much almost the entire sack of coal will become atmospheric CO2, okay? That's a source of CO2, burning that coal. Now, what's a sink of CO2? Well, we all know from our high school years that photosynthesis is a process by which plants suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. And they produce oxygen and they produce carbohydrates, right? CO2 is taken on by plants, and that's called assimilation of CO2. And in the case of, let's say, grassland, where you have grasses that are then eaten by, let's say, cows, these grasses, they also take on CO2, and that carbon from the atmospheric CO2 then goes into the roots, and from the roots it goes into the soil. And that's a process referred to as carbon sequestration. And all plants and all soils do it. And it's a beautiful thing. Because if you think of agriculture and forestry, two of the main processes involved in land use. Agriculture and forestry in the United States combined emit approximately 10.5% of greenhouse gases of the total. So of all greenhouse gases emitted in the United States, 10.5% stem from agriculture and forestry. But 11.8% of all greenhouse gases go into agriculture and forestry because agriculture and forestry are an important sink. So overall, it's almost a wash because agriculture and forestry take on more greenhouse gases than they give off. And that's, again, a nuance that you never hear discussed in the media, and I don't understand why, because agriculture and forestry are such important solution providers. Plus, they nourish us, provide fiber and timber and so on that are essential for human existence. So I keep hearing all of this blaming of agriculture for climate change, and I cannot help to say, stop it, because we know that the most important culprit of our changing climate is the use of fossil fuel. And if we want to curb that, if we want to push that curve down and reduce our impacts on climate, we need to find alternatives to burning fossil fuels. There is no climate expert I've ever met who would disagree with the assertion that fossil fuel use is the main culprit for a changing climate. However, there are people out there who say, no, that's not true. It is what we eat that changes the climate. And in particular, they say it is the animal source foods we eat that's changing the climate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was hoping we would get into that. Mainstream media, or you're on social media, there's a lot of blame targeting farming and animals, livestock, as the culprit for methane gases, which is causing climate change. And I feel like, you've done a very nice job of explaining sort of the percentages in terms of where the majority of the carbon footprint is, affecting climate change. But why is it that you think that the media and social media are so hooked on blaming livestock and farming?
That's an important question. Before I answer your last question, I need to answer the first one, namely the issue around methane and livestock, because that's at the core of the whole discussion, okay? So I explained to you what CO2 does, where it comes from, and why it's so important. Now let's talk about methane briefly, because this is the Achilles heel of agriculture and the cause of all the blame. So before I go to methane, I just want to finish up on CO2. CO2 is the least potent on a per molecule basis with respect of trapping heat from the sun. Methane is 28 times more potent in trapping heat from the sun per molecule than CO2. And nitrous oxide, 265 times more potent than CO2. So methane and nitrous oxide are much more potent in trapping heat from the sun. But there are other differences. And one in particular that comes to mind that's very critical, and that is the fact that while CO2 and nitrous oxide are long-lived climate pollutants, meaning once they are emitted into the atmosphere, they stay active for thousands of years, methane is different. Methane has a lifespan of only 1 decade. In other words, it's a short-lived climate pollutant that's not just produced, but it's also destroyed. And when looking at the numbers, when looking at the budgets here in the United States or globally, you will find that the amount of methane that's put out by various sources, such as swamps or rice paddies or ruminant animals such as cattle or buffaloes and so on, that the amount that's put out and the amount that's destroyed by an atmospheric process called oxidation is almost in balance. The amount produced and the amount destroyed are almost in balance. The process by which methane is destroyed has a scientific name called hydroxyl oxidation. And that's the process by which a radical in the air takes hydrogen away from methane, which is CH4, and converts methane into CO2 again. And that takes 10 years. And now I have to lead you through something, and it will take me 2 minutes, but it's very important, that explains why methane is so different. The so-called biogenic methane is the methane that comes, let's say, from ruminant animals that belch that methane out, or that produce manure that then produces methane. Why is that methane? And why is the greenhouse gas from a, let's say, ruminant animal such as a cow so different from a greenhouse gas that stems from fossil fuels? Here's why. When you take carbon out of the ground as fossil fuel that was stored there for hundreds of millions of years, and you burn it and put it into the atmosphere, then that's a one-way street, okay, from down in the ground up in the atmosphere. And the more you burn, the more goes into the atmosphere, the more heating you get. But have your listeners ever thought about where methane comes from? What its origin is, the origin of the carbon in the methane, and the fate of that carbon? I bet most people have not, but I want to lead you through it because it's critical to understand and separate facts from fiction. Think of photosynthesis. What do plants need to grow? They need largely three things. They need sunlight, they need water, and they need atmospheric CO2, carbon dioxide. And during photosynthesis, they take that carbon from the air, the CO2, and they make it into plant carbohydrates, such as cellulose or starch and others. They also produce oxygen and so on. That's a different story. So that carbon that was in the atmosphere as CO2 is now in the plant in form of carbohydrates. Now comes our Bessie along, a cow, and eats that plant. And with it, the carbon contained therein. A portion of that carbon she will belch out as enteric methane. And some more methane will come off from her manure. That methane and the carbon in that methane, and again, methane is CH4, that carbon that's in the methane originated from atmospheric CO2. But now it's in the atmosphere as methane. It stays in the atmosphere as methane for 10 years, and then a radical comes along and steals the hydrogen from the CH4 from the methane and converts it back into atmospheric CO2. In other words, the carbon that's contained in the methane originates in atmospheric CO2, and it becomes atmospheric CO2 again after it's oxidized. In other words, if you have constant herds of cattle, let's say, and that's the case in the United States. In fact, we have even decreased over the last few decades beef cattle, dairy cattle, and so on. Certainly not increased. If you don't increase cattle herds, but you keep them constant, then that means the amount of methane produced and the amount of methane destroyed equal each other out. You're not adding additional new carbon to the atmosphere, and hence you're not adding additional new warming to the atmosphere with constant livestock herds. Mm-hmm. If we were to increase livestock herds, we would add warming because we would add new methane. That would be bad, but we're not doing it. But now comes something really exciting. Something really exciting is that if you find ways to reduce atmospheric methane, let's say from livestock, by feeding them feed additives, or by making them more efficient, or by finding ways to reduce manure methane, then you are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. You're literally pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and that has a net cooling effect. Meaning, if you manage to decrease methane from livestock, you induce atmospheric cooling. And so I hope that this makes sense, that this is very different, whether you look at fossil fuel-related carbon on the one side or biogenic methane from livestock on the other.
What I hear you say is that the methane seems to go through a cycle. Like a circular cycle, ground up through the cattle, back down into the ground.
It's called the biogenic carbon cycle, from atmospheric CO2 to plant-derived carbon, carbohydrates. Then it goes enteric methane, and then that enteric methane after 10 years becomes atmospheric CO2 again, and the cycle starts over and over and over. So that is a cycle, and the other thing is a one-way street.
In terms of reducing methane production in cattle, you said, if we increase our livestock, we increase methane production. Does the same hold true if you decrease your cattle production? That is a way to reduce methane, or are there other ways to reduce methane? I know you mentioned a couple, but I'm not sure what those involve.
Right. So let me describe really briefly how that methane is formed, okay? So if you think of a cow, she's a ruminant, obviously. She has 4 stomachs. The first one is called a rumen, and that rumen is the size of your bathtub, approximately 50 gallon in size, so it's massive. And it's so big so that the animals can eat large amounts of grass, swallow it, for half an hour or so, and then they lay down, and then they bring it back up and chew it again and swallow it and chew it up and so on. That's called rumination. During this process of rumination, this cow produces enteric methane. That enteric methane can be suppressed either through use of feed additives, where you feed the cow an enzyme inhibitor that then stops the production of methane in the rumen, and therefore she then belches less. You can also feed her things such as seaweed, and there are several things that we know work in suppressing enteric methane. There are also really good technologies that you can use to reduce manure-derived methane, such as anaerobic digesters, where you take animal manure, you put it in a oxygen-deprived environment, and you produce so-called biogas. And that biogas can be used to then make fuel for vehicles, or it can be used to make power for housing. And that's being done. In fact, here in California, it's being done at large scale, so large that we have now, over the last 2 years, reduced methane from livestock by 25%, which is huge.
Mm-hmm. And that's just by alternative methods you're mentioning.
Correct. And I might remind you, if you reduce methane, then you're actively pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, which has a cooling effect. So what I'm telling you is, not just do I think the fear-mongering around livestock is misplaced, largely agenda-driven, but I'm also telling you that if you run livestock right, if you use technologies and techniques that suppress methane, then you can actually make livestock a climate solution. You can generate a climate-neutral enterprise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It also, reading between the lines, suggests that, getting rid of all the livestock is potentially dangerous.
Jill, I have to say, I'm getting really tired of a small but very vocal minority of people who feel that because their own eating choice is that of being plant-based, the rest of the planet should follow. Not just is it a small minority, but it is a minority that follows a diet that is not the successful one they exclaim.
Can we dig into that a little bit? What do you mean?
So in the United States, we have approximately 1% or so vegans. We have a significant number of young people who try this form of nutrition in their 20s, and 84% of them stay with it for 1 year or less. 84%. That means 16% stay with it for longer than 1 year. That means the retention rate of veganism is extremely low. And that's very much to the dismay of the Vegan Society of the United States, which, of course, wants to make sure that this diet, this plant-based or plant-only diet, is a sustainable one. But something must be missing. And I'm an air quality specialist, not a dietitian or sociologist or someone who actually understands the social or psychological dynamic behind it. But what is clear to me is something must be missing, because if this diet were so successful, people would stay with it for a long time or forever. But they don't. For every one active vegan in the United States, there are 5 former vegans. That's what an 84% rate means, that 84% withdraw after 1 year. Every one active vegan, you have 5 former vegans. That to me is not a sign of a sustainable diet, one that is very attractive. I don't know what is missing. Is it nutrients? Is it taste? But something is missing for people to go back to an omnivore diet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what does that mean, though? Let's imagine, because I feel like I remember you saying something in your lecture around the idea that our global ability to sustain a plant-based diet for everybody in the world, or even a certain percentage of individuals in the world, might be a really tall order.
Yeah. So I oftentimes hear the same fraction of people who I just referred to saying, how about we just all stop eating animal source foods and grow on all that land, on all agricultural land that's available in the world, plants directly instead of animals? What about that? Well, that is, in my opinion, far-fetched, and here is why. If you think of the agricultural land that we have here in the United States or that we have globally, then 70%, that's 70% of that agricultural land is what we refer to as marginal land. Marginal land. What does marginal land mean? It means that you cannot grow crops there for various reasons, whether it be a lack of water or whether it be insufficient soil quality, you just cannot grow crops there. What grows on 70% of all agricultural land in the US and globally? Well, what grows there is largely non-human edible biomass, such as cellulose-containing grasses and legumes. They grow there. Now, can we digest cellulose, which is the world's number one biomass? Can we as humans, or can chickens, or can other monogastric animals such as pigs? The answer is no, we cannot digest it. The only animals that can digest cellulose and therefore make use of 70% of all agricultural land are ruminant livestock, such as cattle, sheep, goats. And that's the reason why globally so much agricultural land is used to raise livestock, because we cannot just grow nuts there or soy there or wheat there or something else. The remainder 30% of agricultural land globally and in the United States is what we refer to as arable land. And here you can grow crops because you have enough water and or you have a good soil quality to grow those. So the notion that we should just abandon the use of animal agriculture and everything would just be fine is a fantasy. What's also very interesting to me is you have to always have fertilizers to grow crops, right? Everybody knows that. And what most people don't know is that half of the world's fertilizers are chemical fertilizers. And they're pretty energy intensive to being produced, and energy intensive always means carbon intensive, meaning driving climate change. The other half of all fertilizers used are animal manure. In fact, if you were to eat organic food, then all of these organic crops that you eat must have been fertilized with animal manure, because they must not receive any chemical input such as chemical fertilizers or pesticides. In other words, if you eat organic food, then you can only do so because there is animal agriculture providing the nutrients in form of manure that are needed to fertilize those crops.
So without the animals, you really can't eat organic.
Right. So if you were a vegan and you were to say, all I eat is organic crops, then that's an oxymoron. You cannot be a vegan and only eat organic crops because your organic crops were fertilized with animal manure.
Wow. So I definitely want to ask the question about global warming and the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of people are saying, you see pictures of India, of Delhi, and now you can actually see clear skies there instead of all the smog. And we're hearing stories of, major cities in California where the smog is lifting. What, given this pandemic and essentially a countrywide shutdown of, air flights, driving, all the stuff that we're typically doing, is there any data that you know of to suggest that global warming has slowed down at all during this time frame?
Okay, so first of all, I would recommend for those of you who are interested in this topic to visit my Twitter handle. GHG Guru is my Twitter handle, because I discussed that in great detail there. And it's a very interesting, but also very multifaceted question. So first of all, it's true that when you look at our world from space during this COVID-19 disaster, you find as a bright spot that air pollution has decreased in many, if not most parts of the world, because half of the world is in lockdown. So, as you said, India, parts of China, northern Italy, Germany, and so on, the east coast of the United States show really good air quality right now. So air pollutants have gone down. Things such as smog-forming gases or particles have gone down, and that means air quality in those areas is better. However, agriculture has not, decreased activity because we need to eat. Our agricultural sector is in full throttle, okay? Because our farmers, just like our health professionals, don't have the luxury to say, oh, we just stay home now for a couple of months and wait until it's all over. They are feeding us as we speak. And as a result, the emissions they normally produce, such as ammonia or hydrogen sulfide or particles, are still emitted by agriculture. So that's the one part of the question, namely that air pollution has gone down, and that's largely a function, by the way, of a drastic reduction of the burning of fossil fuel. Because that's where the pollutants come from the burning of fossil fuel, burning of gasoline in cars and airplanes and so on. Yesterday, a paper was published in Nature, and I tweeted and I wrote a blog about it, that actually looked at the greenhouse gas picture. And that to me is, of course, particularly interesting because here we can now compare the impact of fossil fuel-related sources versus agriculture and so on, and what activities really drive our climate. So again, we had a drastic reduction of human activity all over the globe. And as a result of that, carbon emissions have decreased by about 40%, 40, an unprecedented reduction of CO2. But remember what I said about CO2. It has a lifespan of 1,000 years. So all the CO2 that you have ever put into the atmosphere by driving a car or flying someplace or so, all of that carbon related to Jill's lifetime activities is still in the atmosphere. And every time you add new carbon, you add to an existing stock. That's why carbon emissions always go up, okay? Because CO2 is emitted, it's going up, but it's not really taken down in any major way. So what we see is that there are massive reductions of CO2 emissions globally, and half of those reductions in CO2 emissions are because of surface transportation, okay? Surface transportation has gone down so much that half of the world's CO2 reductions can be explained by that alone. Flying has come to a standstill internationally, okay? We might have 5% of the normal air traffic. But flying actually had a relatively small impact on CO2 emissions, to the surprise of many. By far, the number one driver was surface transportation, meaning cars, trucks, trains, and so on. We also see that industries have gone down. The coal industry, in particular, we have burned much less coal, we have produced less power, and so on. That has had a big impact. But the transportation sector was the 800-pound gorilla. If you look at these total reductions of greenhouse gases during the COVID-19 times and compare that to emissions, let's say, from cattle, you will see that the cattle are a tiny, tiny little wedge of the total pie. I mean, they are dwarfed it. And to me, this should be a wake-up call for everyone out there interested in this topic to really know what it is that we need to do to address climate concerns. And we need to stop pointing fingers at our food supply and understand that not just are those climate effects of our food supply relatively small, but our food supply is essential. It is strategically important, just like our health sector is. I mean, people don't seem to understand what we are dealing with when we are bashing farmers day in, day out. What we are doing is we are pushing a strategically important sector of society out of their businesses. And then the question is, where will we get our food from? I just give you a little statistics that I find fascinating. From the recent agricultural census of the United States, I know the following numbers. How many farmers do we have in the United States? 2 million. But of the 2 million farmers we have, 1.5 million have an annual revenue of less than $25,000. Now think about what that means. 1.5 out of 2 million farmers are hobby farmers. They have an annual revenue of less than $25,000. It is only 80,000 farmers in the United States today, 80,000 that produce 2/3 of all the food we consume. And the average age of these 80,000 farmers is 60. They're 60 years old on average. And these people are now at a stage of their lives where they are close to retirement and where they wonder, shall I really pass this on to the next generation? Mm-hmm. And with all this public pressure mounting over things that are really largely unsubstantiated, the answer they're giving themselves is all too often now, no, I don't want that for my son, for my daughter to be a defining life pattern. I don't want that. I want something better for them. Mm-hmm. And this is happening right now. And for people who don't believe me, just talk to the farming community and you will find that that is true.
Yeah.
We have to be very careful with our farming sector because these are the people who produce every nutrient that you put into your mouth every day, and treat them with respect they deserve.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. How does food waste factor into greenhouse gases and climate change and that whole topic?
So this whole COVID-19 here has, of course, amplified everything related to food loss and food waste in ways that we have never seen before. Obviously, now all restaurants are shut and all schools are shut. So all of a sudden, the fluid milk supply, for example, has no place to go. There's no market for it, or a small market. There's a lot of food wasted these days. We call this food loss, actually, where in Florida, let's say 70% of all fruits and vegetables were plowed under. 70, that is, where farmers in Wisconsin, dairy farmers, dumped their milk because schools were shut and there was no place to put that milk. No, but these are extreme times. In normal times, before COVID-19 hit, and of course that will happen again in the future, we are wasting an enormous amount of food. In the United States and other developed countries, we are wasting 40% of all food produced. 40, that is, 40%, almost half of all food we produce in this country goes to waste. And that is not me saying it's going to some food shelters or so, or it's going, elsewhere. It's going to landfills, or it's rotting. And the reason why it's largely wasted is because of two things. So in the developed world, the majority of food waste that occurs at the consumer level. And that means in restaurants and in our kitchens. And that is because when we go to the supermarkets and we buy food, we pick our avocados based on ripeness and color and so on. If something is not perfect, then we just leave it behind. And because everybody does that, a lot of food is sorted out and thrown away. 40% is a number of food waste, not just in the United States and other developed countries, but to my great surprise, it is a number that even holds true globally, even in developing countries. Think about that. In the third world, in African countries, also about 40% food waste occurs, but there it's more on the food loss side, meaning the farms actually produce the food, but when it's time to harvest, either don't have the machinery or the means to transport it to the markets, or they don't have means to preserve food, and so forth, also leading to a 40% loss rate. So it is actually a global number that we are fighting right now. And by far, if you look at the environmental footprint of our food supply, of our entire food system, then by far the number one issue we have to fight is food loss, food waste. That's the greatest environmental impact is associated with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how does that really, like when you think as a professor or scientist, your expertise in this area, what are your biggest concerns when we look at our food supply and climate change and food waste and carbon footprint? What keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night is that people are fear-mongering the public to believe that our food system is ruining the planet, when indeed it is other sectors, mainly, chiefly the fossil fuel sector. What keeps me up at night is that these pressures that are built by people who built a smokescreen to obscure their own contributions to environmental pollution by pointing at farming, that they are endangering our food supply chain in ways that is immense. Farmers are now feeling so much pressure. They are feeling blamed for anything out there, from climate change to COVID-19. Okay, I mean, seriously, there are people now who say COVID-19 is a result of our farming practices. It is absurd what I'm hearing out there, but I'm hearing it, and our farmers hear that. I am really concerned that this strategically important sector of society, our farming sector, decides, you know what, we don't need this. We hardly make any meaningful living here with what we do, even though we're working our tails off. And on top of that, we are blamed for all the ills in the world. We are not staying in this business anymore. And then I ask you, Jill, if they decide to make that step, and I want to remind you, it's 80,000 producing 2/3 of our food. If they make the step out of agriculture, where will we get our food from? Several months ago, I wouldn't have worried about it so much, but now during COVID-19, I go to the supermarket, and for the first time in my life, I'm confronted with food rationing, where I want to get 2 flats of eggs, and I'm not allowed to. Where I want to get a couple gallons of milk, I'm not allowed to. I can have 1 gallon of milk. Are you kidding me? We are in the 21st century in the United States, and we are experiencing food rationing. If we don't stop this whole smokescreen around agriculture and its environmental footprint, and all the other associated issues that are tooted nonstop, then our farmers will say goodbye. And I don't want that. And we don't want that. And we cannot afford it.
When I think about parents who are listening to this show, and, a lot of the parents that I know and who listen are very concerned about, raising healthy eaters, raising planet-aware children. How can families do their part to minimize carbon footprint, and what should they be saying?
So, first of all, I'm very concerned about all of that myself. I have a 5-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl, and we spend a lot of time around food. I teach them about how food is grown, how to prepare food. In fact, my 5-year-old cooked me scrambled eggs this morning, and he was so proud when he presented that to me. I thought it was awesome. I remember my mother doing that to me when I was 6 years old, so I'm really pleased about that. They learned so much about food because my wife and I feel it's very important for them to understand where food is grown, how it's grown, how we prepare it, the value of foods, how it should be eaten, and how it should not be wasted, and what the true externalities around food are and what they're not. What I'm not at all concerned about is I'm not concerned about the carbon footprint of our food as much as I am about the carbon footprint of our transportation choices and our heating choices and our vacation choices and so on. What we eat has an environmental footprint, but it is critical for our subsistence. Okay, there's no alternative to it. What I'm concerned about when it comes to food and kids is that they eat a lot of junk. I'm very concerned about that. Over half of what our kids put in their mouths these days is ultra-processed food. And this is not good for them, okay? In my opinion, we need to do a much better job getting healthier foods into our kids. And with healthier foods, I don't mean plant-based. I mean all sorts of foods that are more in their basic form and less in the ultra-processed form. I want also to emphasize that I think it's absolutely critical that we teach our kids in schools more about food, more about agriculture, more about the interplay, about those who grow it and those who consume it, and why we shouldn't waste it, and if we don't eat it right, how it gets us sick. And we should also develop a culture again of celebrating our foods and not fearmonger around it. I mean, food is a beautiful thing. Food is not just a necessity, it's a beautiful thing. It's something that defines us. It's something that's important to us culturally. We should celebrate it. And we should make it an enjoyable complex and not one to scare people about.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I'm curious, what do you think it means to be nourished?
To be nourished does not just mean to have enough calories. In a country like ours, you will find that people who are poor are oftentimes also obese. And the reason why that connection exists is because the energy-rich diets are generally the cheapest ones. So calorie-packed soda pops and so on, all this stuff that we eat that's ultra-processed and contains a lot of calories is actually not very good for us. What we really should consume is nutrient-rich food and not calorie-rich food. So to be well-nourished does not mean to have enough calories, but to be well-nourished means to have a balanced, nutritionally balanced diet. of real foods and not a bunch of ultra-processed slop, which we oftentimes see being fed to our kids. And I really have an issue with that. I have a big issue with that. And what kids eat when they are at some kind of a venue, I feel, my gosh, there must be something else to life than what these kids are offered there. So well-nourished kids should eat a balanced diet, a nutrient-rich diet. They should also consume drinks such as milk and so forth that are nutrient-rich and not just a general beverage. We can do better than giving them a bunch of sodas and that kind of stuff.
I really like what you said about educating children in schools about how food is grown. And I am hopeful that that is something that will start to come back into the school system in the near future, hopefully. Dr. Mitloehner, I know you are a super busy guy, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and breaking down, greenhouse gases and climate change. It's a lot. I'm sure my listeners will want to listen to this more than once because it's a lot to process, but you do it so well, and I really appreciate your time. Where can parents and folks who listen to this show learn more about the work that you're doing, and how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Jill, I really appreciated the opportunity to be with you. And these are all really important topics that are a concern to our parents and concern to people like me too, of course. And I research it. I do this day in, day out. And I find it really important to communicate about it as well. And so I established a center here at UC Davis called the CLEAR Center. And if you go to clear.ucdavis.edu, you will find our webpage and many blogs and so on that explain important issues. You will find explainers like what is a greenhouse gas and how do they differ and so forth. So many of the questions you asked me, you will find on that webpage. If you're on social media, you will find me on Twitter at GHGGuru. That's my handle. GHG stands for greenhouse gas. You will find a lot of really interesting discussions there. It's a very active Twitter site, and I also have a blog. And you will find all of that if you go to my webpage. Again, clear.ucdavis.edu.
Awesome. I'm going to include all those links in the show notes. Everybody, make sure you check out that Twitter page. It's pretty lively.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, folks, there you have it. I hope you do have a better understanding of climate change, greenhouse gases, and all that is involved. You might even want to re-listen to this episode a few times to make sure that you get the overall big picture down pat. What I got out of this is that if we want to have an impact on our planet, we need to start to consider our fossil fuel usage and our food waste as primary contributors to this situation. I hope you'll check out the CLEAR Center as a resource for you when you have questions yourself or you get questions from others. Again, that's at clear.ucdavis.edu. I'll be sure to include that link in the show notes over at jillcastle.com/111. That's 111 for episode number 111. And again, if you're not subscribed to The Nourished Child, head over to iTunes or any Android app and hit the subscribe button. That way, you'll be sure to get my new shows every time they release. And while you're there, if you don't mind, take a moment to rate and review the show. When you do, it really helps other parents find the Nourished Child podcast. Again, thanks for joining me today. I truly appreciate and am very grateful that you choose to listen to this show. Stay safe, stay well, and be sure to give your child, big or small, a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.